to go into the subject for today. Now, did you all get a chance to dive into a couple of the readings about the student movement in Chile? And even the reading on the Mapuche movement by Bidegain? Saying his name wrong. All right, look, let's just take it from now, if you like. I'm not sure how much you've tapped into the news about what has transpired in Chile since October 2019. I mean, when it began, okay, here we can see an image of students on the move. This is not from 2019. This is a bit older. You can tell by the fashion, can't you? Yeah. But what I want to emphasize by flagging up this image, can we all see it at home? Did I share the image already? Yeah.
Yes.
Is that that diachronic view, again, that just because something like the October outbreak occurred doesn't mean that that was some solitary moment in time without a backstory, without a history of movements to bring us to that point. And students, of course, were really instrumental in what's known as the October outbreak, in sparking it off. Yeah, sorry. Thanks for reminding me. Is that better? Okay. So, when we talk about theories of social and political action through the framework of something like political opportunity, often we have, and I've called it before, game, set, match, kind of like a game, you know, a tennis game, that things going to play out in a particular way, someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. But if we understand social movements as building over time and as having both successes and failures, as having a set of disparate aims involving disparate groups and different claims, we can see that whilst there can be, in a social movement that builds over time and overall direction, there can be different analyses of reality. There can be different ways of doing politics itself, of identifying political opportunity where it may exist, or arguably creating opportunity, yeah, within or without the institutional politics of a given period or government, yeah. So I want us to sort of extend our thinking beyond, I suppose, that quite structural approach of political opportunity, which, even though it offers some insight into particular spaces that may open up or may become available for political action, underestimates scenarios in which social and political movements deliberately seek to work outside of the given institutional framework. Yeah? And you as students would know that working within the mainstream itself, or even confronting the mainstream of politics, can seem impossible, can seem to be an entrapment, can seem to be off limits, inaccessible, operating according to its own logics, and completely incognizant, yeah, of the realities of what you as students live, yeah, even as the political economy of, you know, particular policies around healthcare, around education, do touch down in people's individual lives and impact us all in different ways. Our consciousness about these things is never free-falling, independent of the context in which we live. It arises from struggle itself. That's how consciousness comes into being. So thinking about movements on the move, I think, is important. Thinking about context, thinking about the decisions and strategies that are developed over time is likewise really important when we look at, say, the student movement in Chile and what latterly has erupted as a long process, yeah? So in the kind of summary for the context of today, of what we're going to talk about, Chile movements in movement, student movement and Mapuche movement, there was a bit of a precis, yeah, of the period of the so-called transition to democracy in Chile. Now, Charlie, I know that you watched that film in another course that's called No, yeah? And yeah, the sort of campaign around the plebiscite in Chile that was to bring an end to the Pinochet regime or to continue, yeah? So from 1973 to 1990, Chile was basically under the sway of obviously a centralized state planning kind of role around economic policy, but one that was very much inflected by neoliberal ethos, yeah, in all areas of life, undercut social welfare, but most importantly, heralded by initially a coup. So in 1973, a military junta took over the elected government, overthrew the elected government of Salvador Allende in Chile. Salvador Allende was a leftist, a socialist, who by popular decree achieved the presidency by democratic electoral means. But amongst, you know, the wealthy and elite sectors of Chile, and also the sort of geopolitical interests in connection with the United States, the idea that there was a socialist government anywhere in the South that was popularly elected at this time was untenable. And so in 1973, actually September the 11th, yeah, that's the other September 11th, 9/11, that's when Pinochet, with his junta, committed a coup on the presidential palace, and Salvador Allende died, yeah, in the bombing of that palace. But as I've already made reference to, the transition to democracy is precisely that period where the Chilean citizenry voted no to a continuation of the rule of the junta and in favour of a transition to democracy. So since 1990, we've seen a broad centre-left coalition of a range of parties under the flagship of the so-called concertación, but only really up to 2010, yeah? So, but that's a pretty substantive period. That's 20 years in the so-called transition to democracy in the country, alternating between different presidents in that coalition who represented a range of political parties, some of which are mentioned up there. You may have heard the name of Michelle Bachelet, who actually is the daughter of a former leftist who, you know, met an ill fate under Pinochet, and she herself had to come here as a young student. So she spent some time living in exile with family here in Australia. Yeah, so there is a connection to Australia even at that moment. A lot of people came in that initial period in the early 70s after the coup, in the first 5 years, as exiles. Yeah, so Sydney has a large portion of that wave of Chileans that arrived in the 70s, yeah, under the humanitarian visa arrangements of the then Whitlam government in Australia. So we have to keep account of the fact that Australia, in parallel, also had a socially reformist government in power, yeah, at the time of the coup. And so that allowed a conduit for Chileans escaping Pinochet to come to Australia under the government of Whitlam, right? As you can see, whilst it marked a degree of stability and a movement towards democracy after dictatorship, by the time we get to 2010, the concertación dissolves, and we see the rising of a new political party, the National Renewal Party, which is a centre-right party, in 2010, and the first term of Sebastián Piñera, who's a multi-millionaire media magnate. That's not immaterial. That's really important to keep in mind. He considers himself to be middle class, but that's something more than middle class. And then alternancy again, with a move back to Bachelet, because of a lot of the crises, political crises, that were occurring with the inception of the National Renewal Party and the contention by students, as we'll see shortly, against the kinds of deepening of neoliberal reform that someone like Piñera represented, and back to Bachelet, but here under the new majority party. No longer la concertación, that dissolves. So the political landscape has evolved. She had a 4-year term, so she's been president twice. And that was a bit of a first, obviously, for Latin America, right, to have a female president in 2 terms. Not the only one, by the way, but certainly a pioneer in that sense. And from 2018 to 2022, we have the return of Piñera. Again, not without a huge degree of contention, because this is seen as very threatening to the left in particular in Chile. And only latterly, in 2019, with the outbreak, do we have the beginning of the call for him to resign in the social outbreak, yeah? Which, of course, he doesn't do. But the mobilizations that occurred in the social outbreak really pushed the limits of the legitimacy of institutional politics and the legitimacy of the continuation of Piñera and his party, yeah? So just in March, Gabriel Boric, who's a former student leader of the Federation of Chilean Students, former activist, if you Google his name, a picture of a very shabby-haired guy comes up. He's 36. These 20 years, from the time he was in secondary school to being a university student, he was involved in student politics. And some of that was engaging the institutional powers and channels of politics, but a lot of that was mobilizing outside of the institutional framework. So he has that degree of experience and that degree of legitimacy as well from a broad base of Chilean society. And the party that he heads up is a new one called Convergencia Social, Social Convergence, founded in 2018 by the autonomous movement, the Libertarian Left, Socialism and Freedom and New Democracy Party. Now, in 2019, in that October outbreak, besides the resignation of Piñera, the other chief demand was for the formulation of a new constitution. Why? Because Chile, albeit had already undergone several decades of democratization, had not changed the constitution that was established by the Pinochet regime in 1980. And this particular constitution has been seen as a symbol and an instrument of exactly what that dictatorship has represented for Chile. Its legacy and its continuity. It sets legal institutional barriers that further cemented the regime's neoliberal socio-economic and political vision. It established a stifling binomial electoral system, kind of two-party. We saw before the concertación and then Piñera's party. There wasn't much space in institutional politics beyond the two-party system. Numerous high quorum and supra-majoritarian requirements for the amendment of the Constitution, constant blocks for any proposals for amendments to that very Constitution and its organic laws, yeah, including over territory, and further articles associated with so-called counterinsurgency measures and state of emergency measures provided through the regime's constitution. Yeah. Issues such as the education system and as I've already said, the electoral system effectively equipped a political minority with veto power, including the political heirs of the dictatorship itself. Finally, the predominantly conservative constitutional court was equipped with a wide-ranging sort of powers to preemptively strike out against provisions it deemed unconstitutional while they were being discussed in Congress. So the Constitution was at the forefront of people's demands, the change of the Constitution, and the change not just of the Constitution, but of a new constituent process to enable that change, involving actors outside of the main institutions of government in Chile, outside of the political parties, the main political parties. The October outbreak started as a protest against a metro, the subway, transport hike. Yeah? A group of students from secondary schools in Chile triggered that first protest. And around this grew increasing mobilizations. One of the slogans used was, it's not 30 pesos, that is the subway hike, the fare hike, because it's going to go up by 30 pesos. It's 30 years. So remember, from 1990? Okay. Piñera declared that Chile was a true oasis of stable democracy and that none of this would prevail, especially vis-a-vis neighbouring countries, yeah? And so this is where Chile has often been touted by its political leaders as the exception, as almost first world, you know, against the grain of Venezuela, against the grain of even, you know, some of the political crises that have occurred in the other parts of the southern cone. But this was an illusion, right? A few days after the transport hike, protests evolved into ever greater manifestations and demonstrations, as well as confrontations and radical actions, including the destruction of poverty. Well, that'd be great. Property. That was an interesting sort of Freudian slip. Yeah, some of the students who jumped the turnstiles, because that was also the thing, you know, the injunction to jump the turnstiles, actually began to smash up the metro stations. Yeah. So the social outburst, as it became known, el estallido social, or Chilean Spring, it's interesting how they sort of borrow from the Arab Spring, isn't it, in media discourse. No, I think it's just commonplaces in media discourses, especially where it's seen as a surprise by the powers that be, yeah? And it's not really a surprise. No. Well, previous student mobilizations were also referred to as the Chilean winter, so, and that was before 2011, so it's up for grabs. But this initial outburst resulted in more than 20 deaths and thousands of wounded civilians because the repression by Piñera's government was really severe. And I can remember at the time my friend Socorro sending me some vision from people who had been using their iPhones. And I just saw like huge amounts of military, Robocop style, and tanks coming in to like side streets and stuff. And I'm like, what the? Like, I just couldn't believe that it would, result in that kind of repression, given that Chile was supposedly a stable democracy, you know, an oasis, not like other neighbouring countries, etc., etc. Yeah. Now, of course, repression wasn't the only response because the protests just grew and grew and grew and grew. And Piñera offered concessions, but they were never really enough. So one of the things was to do a pension reform that would allow people to access more of their pension at the age of 80. And people just thought that was a disgrace. This is not a concession. This is a manipulation. No one, like if you don't have a good quality of life, how can you get to 80? So a combination of concessions, reforms, and repressions were unable to diffuse the greatest crisis that Chile had faced since its transition to democracy. Scholars have looked at the role of grievances, political attitudes toward Piñera and the establishment. They also look at protest tactics and the relationship between mobilization and repression. All these things are familiar to us, aren't they? Now, students were clearly key to sort of setting off the spark, but they weren't the only groups that began to mobilize. And we saw a great number of people who did not belong to any political affiliation or even organization become involved. More visible demands began to arise, such as around improvement in pensions, which I've already mentioned, healthcare reform. This is before the pandemic, just before the pandemic, by the way. And obviously a new constitution under an independent constitutional assembly. Issues that went well beyond the concerns of secondary and university students. And also, since October, even the more organized social movement organizations have played a lesser role than what we'll look at in the tutorials, which is the territorial assemblies that emerged in different parts of Santiago and other cities in Chile. So this was partly replaced by social media networking and sort of spontaneous action. But as I said, the emergence of assemblies as well. So you can see that the transport height was just the tip of the iceberg. Now here's an interesting couple of counterpoise photos. Chile before early October 2019. Yeah, you can see the Cordillera, the Andes, beautiful. You also see downtown, the oasis for capital. And then Chile, just a week later. Santiago, Chile. Yeah? My friend Carlos was not following how things were going over there. And he said, oh, I think I'll go back to Chile, you know, like in October because it's my mum's birthday. You know, and he's been living in Australia for 20 years. He hopped on a plane and he's sending people photos of what Santiago looks like, which is the one on the left, and saying, look where I'm going, I'm going to have a good holiday. And he was in the midst of that, literally, when he arrived. And the discourse that emerged was, this is terrorists, we're at war, Chile's at war. There was a lot of media production, remembering that Piñera was a media magnate, right? So, really speaking, we're talking about, sorry? That's part of its exceptionalism, yeah. Yeah. We'll try to keep it that way, yeah. Yeah. It takes a little bit of like fancy footwork at times, but yeah. So it wasn't just one moment, it was an accumulation of injuries, yeah? So some of the hashtags used, Chile woke up, we're not at war, educate for peace. It's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years. Extremely high social inequality, decades of abuse of power, almost everything privatized, including water, high taxes and low benefits, precarious jobs, miserable pensions, politicians' outrageous salaries and benefits, and high student loan debts. Yeah? So government authorities saw this as a big surprise, an October surprise. But of course it was anything but. If we understand things from contentious politics, we can talk about grievances and we can talk about contentious politics, the lack of engagement by authorities with demands, yeah, to understand the limits of political opportunity, of course. But this needs to be complemented by other explanations. The political system had become increasingly detached, yeah, elitist, detached from society. And also within even the first period of the transition to democracy, the Concertación governments actually sought to demobilize social movements. So it was a deliberate thing, you know, from the perspective of the first governments of the transition to democracy, to try to, because social movements are seen as a threat to stability in the country, even though they effectively brought an end to the dictatorship, yeah, through their mobilizing. So in the first kind of 5 years after the transition to democracy, there was very little social movement activism. because it was actively discouraged. And this kind of tendency towards disengagement continues, but doesn't foreclose political mobilization from 2005 onward. And why? Because of the accumulation of injuries that we've already started to talk about, because of the incidences of political corruption as well, yeah? So we need that historical view, and we need to use concepts that might enable that. Stock of legacies, repertoire of strategies, they both come from Federico Rossi, yeah? Insider and outsider strategies, how it is that students, feminists, and also Mapuche activists, and in conjunction at times, have worked outside of the official channels, as well as attempting to lobby from within, it's true. Stock of legacies are those, if we talked about accumulation of injuries, we can think about the lessons learned from trying to mobilize in the lack of political opportunity from below, yeah? So what were the forms of social organization that were most effective? The non-hierarchical, the committee and assembly-based, the student-based, you know, what kinds of acts of contention were effective and strategic. So this learning process accounts for, one could argue, the social uprising, it being sparked, and that sort of gathering of force and change of political forces in the country, yeah? The refusal of institutional politics, we find this particularly amongst feminists, yeah? There's a great article in Jacobin, if you get the chance to check that out, you'll see that really feminists and student activists, or feminist student activists, have seen the power of saying no as being primordial to how they do their work. What they see is that it's not about political opportunity and occupying spaces, it's about jumping over the turnstile, yeah? So the figure of the turnstile assumes that one lines up, waits for, you know, puts a coin in, maybe that's a kind of form of lobbying or trying to influence, and then the turnstile turns and you get let in the space. No. So you can see that the students' cry to jump the turnstile resonated in lots of different ways. And it's actually a technique of doing, it's a repertoire of strategy, yeah, to jump the turnstile. This is also known as destituent power, that social movements have the ability, when they coalesce, to absolutely change the balance of political forces. But they don't have to be involved necessarily primarily in institutional politics. But they can actually bring an end to it. They can change the game completely, yeah? The closeness and detachment thesis, okay, activists who've been involved in lobbying through official channels, activists who haven't, dual strategies, they definitely have coexisted. So I think that getting a view of how people have organized from, you know, the initial period of the transition to democracy up to the present day is really important to understand what moment we're at now in Chile. So beyond political opportunity, how might Chilean movement experiences, particularly as seen in the student movements and their waves of mobilization, show up the limits of political opportunity? Yeah? And its theories and its models. How might even the events and dynamics since October 2019 test some of those tenets? Political opportunity might lean on contentious politics, especially with the uncivil strategies, you know, of like smashing things up. But the opportunity that's open there is that you get more visibility and more conversation. You break through stalemates, including of the media and its discourses. And you also begin to meet one another, yeah? That's a really important thing too, yeah? Meeting each other in a march, meeting people that you might never have met before, occupying a square. So one of the main squares that was renamed in Chile during this period is La Plaza de la Dignidad, yeah? The Plaza of Dignity, that's what the activists renamed it, because that's what they believed they were involved in. dignification, restoring dignity to Chilean people. Yeah, and so it's important to really foreground, I suppose, you know, where some of the tenets of political process models fall short. And it's important to have that historical view. You might have heard of the mochilazo. A mochila is a backpack. Okay, so mochilazo provides a visual register for hundreds, thousands of students running with their backpacks on. So whatever they have in their backpacks may serve them. It might be what they use at school, but it might also be tools for protest. But they were on the move. That was their MO, modus operandi. Yeah? The student rebellion that occurred even early in that period of active demobilization of social movements, yeah, in the 2000s, where students went out to the streets to demand a free school pass. So early on, they're foregrounding the importance of redistribution and social policies, yeah, which in the context of a very income unequal country is important for all segments of society. Yeah, the basics of traveling, of being able to travel. This was going to be signed up to a private company, the travel pass, with a certain kind of credit system. And they rebelled against that. It started in public schools. I'm talking about secondary schools, yeah? And spread to large metro areas. Tens of thousands of students stormed the streets for a whole month. And out of this was formed one of the chief student organizations, yeah? The Asamblea Coordinadora de Estudiantes Secundarios, or ACES. And this modeled itself on the assembly form as well, which we'll talk about in the tutorial, the importance of the assembly form. Now, even though 2001 was important for the mochilazo, as I said before, it's only really from about 2005 that things really begin to pick up speed with mobilizations in the country. It's from 1990 until, so the first decade and a half of the transition to democracy, mobilizations are actively discouraged, appeased, demobilized. But this gives us a sort of concept, I suppose, of some key moments. 2005, 2006, and 2011. In 2005, we see mobilizations by uni students. Some of them may have also been secondary school students. So we don't want to lose that line of connection, do we? This is occurring across generations. Mobilizing in the face of the threats and opportunities posed by a proposed reform to student loans. So they found particular issues that they could mobilize around, with, again, a credit system from the state. So the state was willing to, this might sound like Australia. Hex, helps. Okay, so the state was willing to come up with a loan system, potentially to include people of a so-called lower socio-economic standing, but it had higher interest rates. And so students had the analytical ability, being university students as well, to see what was coming, to see this as something that needed to be mobilized around, because it was kind of like, not so much biting the hand that feeds you, because the hand doesn't even feed you. It's just seeing that what this proposed progressive reform has within it a really regressive element. Yeah? And so the bill that arose as a result of the protests also was trying to, we would say, a stealth attempt to get something through Congress. Yeah? By the time we get to 2006, April, May, and September, October, we see a resurgence of high school students mobilizing in what is known as the Revolution of the Penguins. So I think that one of the things that's really good for the success of student movements is that they were given characteristics that were loving. For instance, the backpacker wearers or the penguins because of their school uniform. So whilst they were involved in very radical grassroots action, they were seen in affectionate terms by a lot of people, yeah? So the revolution of the penguins was of high school students. They took advantage of the ultimacy of power to Michelle Bachelet, who had come to power basically saying she was all in favour of educational equality. But they pushed that further. So they hijacked her phrase, yeah, and they reframed it. They got involved in massive marches, in occupations and strikes, and they demanded a repeal of the organic constitutional law of education. Not just a reform, a repeal. So you can see here that there is an element of political opportunity that students are involved in, but they try out different techniques over time, different generations. So other demands, you can see a series of demands there. They begin to spell them out. Now, they won some of their demands. For instance, Bachelet was a bit more open, say, than Piñera, definitely. She permitted the use of the school pass outside of school hours, and she pledged grants to cover the cost of the university exam for a lot of disadvantaged students. But this didn't improve conditions for the poorest in terms of access to a quality education system. The university system in Chile is one of the most privatized in the world. Yeah? It didn't change the structure of the education system, and the new law was insufficient or not enacted fully. By the time we have another alternancy, as you saw at the beginning with the scale of changing governments, 2011 they get wind of the fact that Piñera is about to become president, but also that he is going to appoint as education minister a former Pinochet politician from the dictatorship. So this becomes a ground to really, really gather force, yeah? Massive rise in protests in 2011 in May, the so-called Chilean winter that I referred to earlier. The Chilean Student Confederation was formed at this time, and of course Boris has been, that's part of his inheritance, really, and the legacy is playing out now. And you can see the demands just became more and more extensive, and I've listed them there. So students began to see themselves as having constituent power, being able to force politicians to repeal, to change things, yeah, potentially to even change the tide of electoral politics itself. A lot of innovations were gained from that time. So you can see a photo here from a documentary about the Penguin Revolution, when students took possession of classrooms and formed blockades of classrooms, for example. Out of this set of repertoires, innovative strategies, we have the formation of new kinds of political subjectivities amongst students. Sense of grassroots power as being where you do politics. Also the use of popular culture, lots of popular culture, hip-hop, as well as punk music, yeah. Different ways of getting people to identify with the movement. And also distancing from the traditional left, which is really interesting. Students saw themselves as a democratizing force in the face of an illegitimate, disaccredited party system, which seemed interested only in accumulating power. So a drift away from the dominant parties occurs in that first period of mobilizations, consolidation of leftist autonomous groups, the so-called new autonomous left, where Boris comes out of, the Federation of Students that he headed up. There was some factionalism, for example, in the Catholic University. There were students that suspected, that other students were communists, didn't want to align themselves. But more than anything, what was born here was a new kind of federative structure of assemblies amongst students. So this provides an imprint for the new organizational forms that we see even now in Chile. Yeah? Students saw themselves as giving classes, not taking classes, that they were also teachers. This is really important. All right. So we're going to have to come to an end, but there's a really interesting performance that you can see in terms of innovative protest forms outside the Palacio de la Moneda, the presidential palace, which is students reenacting Thriller, and they're zombies of the education system. Now, I didn't want to leave the Mapuches as a side note. In the outbreak, we've seen a lot more solidarity and also intermixing between students, territorial assembly members, and Mapuche people. There are a lot of Mapuche that are located in urban areas, not just in the south of the country. But the Mapuche people have their traditional lands in the south of the country, in what's known as Mapu, yeah? And effectively, they had resided there and resisted the Spanish until well into the colonial period. So they're a cultural group, a linguistic group as well, with a strong cultural identity, but also a group that had suffered under the ravages of the dictatorship and the false promises, really, of democratization, yeah? A lot of activists who are from the Mapuche movement have been imprisoned or charged under terrorist laws, yeah, in the country. And, you know, there's a little bit of a sort of summary of some of the main points that we should take into account in understanding Mapuche activism. But we also see a move from inside